All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to our third installment of the Industry Expert Series, hosted by Enrollment Rx. My name is Matt Palmer, and I am the Director of Client Services here at Enrollment Rx. And I'm excited to bring to you, I think, a very valuable topic today. So, with us today, we have Matt Tate, who's an integration consultant, and he does all things related to integration and imports for our clients. He's one of the smartest guys on our team by far, and I think he has a lot of valuable insights. So prior to Matt coming here, he actually worked at a higher education institution as well. I think doing similar types of work, but he has a lot of great insights today, and we're excited to have him share his expertise. So with that, I'll let Matt kind of introduce himself a little bit further as well.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Greetings, everyone. So thanks for joining today. I am the other Matt at Enrollment Rx. So great to be with you this afternoon or this morning. I joined the integration services team just over a year ago as a consultant. And before coming on board with Enrollment Rx, I had spent a little over 14 years in higher education. I started as a recruiter at a public four-year institution in the state of Illinois. I quickly transitioned over into the operations side of the house and spent 7+ years at that institution in various CRM operations and leadership positions. Then in 2014, moved to St. Louis, Missouri, where I'm currently located. I joined the admissions office at St. Louis University, a great Enrollment Rx client, as assistant director of operations. And in that role, my team and I, we were responsible for all of our daily imports into Salesforce. So Common App, test scores, and all the accompanying PDFs and documentation that went along with all of our various different types of imports. I left SLU in 2018 to take a position with another university here in St. Louis as director of admissions at the medical school for that institution. And what's really relevant from that position to our discussion today was that I was responsible for our day-to-day integration of AMCAS data into our CRM. So centralized applications for MD applicants coming into our CRM and then into our SIS. So all told in my career, so far, I've been on 5 different CRM platforms, including Salesforce now a couple different times, really 4 different student information systems at 3 very different admissions offices, and primarily using 2 different ETL tools. So thanks for joining us today for today's session, and hope everyone can at least come away with one way that you can either come up with a new importer integration or maybe improve upon an existing process.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. So if you want to go ahead and show the agenda, let's talk a little bit about our discussions today. So the first thing is kind of setting the foundation of what are integration and imports, then talking about options for integration and import tools. Matt just referenced, we're going to talk about the most common higher education data sources that we hear or that we see. Integrating the common application to Salesforce, expanding the common application with parent data. So we're going to go through a few scenarios, leveraging integration for alumni and development. So we even have a scenario kind of around that use case as well. And then integration for learner success. So importing the ACT student profile and how you can kind of leverage those things. Key takeaways and Q&A. So real quick on Q&A, there's a Q&A box that you can leverage. There's a chat and a Q&A. Please use the Q&A box. Feel free to pop a question up anytime during the presentation today. If we don't get to it right away, I'll be fielding those initially. We'll have some time at the end of the presentation today to address those. So that would be great. The other thing is, as we go through these series, we have one more after this, but we always like to refine like what we're doing and making sure we provide the most valuable content to you. And so there's going to be a little survey that pops up at the end of the session. If you could just take like 2 minutes to fill that out. We read every comment and take it every piece of feedback. It really just helps us make sure we're continuing to provide the best content. One will also get emailed to you after the session as well if you don't get a chance to fill that out the first time. So with that, Matt, let's go ahead and go to kind of the kickoff here of describing integration and imports.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So let's start talking about what are integration and imports and how they can work together and how they're different. So when we're thinking about integration, we're typically talking about a bidirectional exchange of information between different systems. And with the higher ed, we know that we're collecting data from so many different outside third-party sources, and sometimes even we're collecting data from different data silos, even on our own campuses. And we think about integration as the act of bringing all of these disparate sources together so that we can provide a 360-degree view of our applicants, students, parents, alumni, and maybe even faculty, staff, or other stakeholders. On the Salesforce ecosystem, we think about integration at 4 different levels. So if you are signing on to your Salesforce org with single sign-on using university credentials, you are already leveraging identity integration within Salesforce. And that's really not going to be part of our conversation going forward for today. We're really going to focus on data integration, bringing the various data components from one source into Salesforce. We'll also touch on process integration, to where an action in one system can trigger actions in another system. And we'll see some examples of presentation integration, where you can see documents and data from Common App within Reader Rx and how that information is presented. When we're thinking about imports, a key difference is that we're thinking typically imports as a single direction going into Salesforce. Kind of the other key distinction here is that with integration, there's usually an implied type of automation happening for integration, whether that is data moving on a schedule or some type of process or trigger that is behind that integration. Oftentimes with the native Salesforce tools, that import is really relying on the person between the keyboard and chair to drive that particular import. So in today's conversation, we'll look at some of the native Salesforce tools, such as the import wizard and the data loader, and we'll compare how those work as compared to Import Rx and Enrollment Rx, brought to you by Enrollment Rx, and how those applications will interact with our other pieces of the RAD solution.
Yeah, sounds great, Matt. And just to talk a little bit more about the native Salesforce import tools. So these are the 2 tools that are provided out of the box by Salesforce. One is the data import wizard. Another one is the data loader. So if you're not familiar with any one of these, there's trailheads on it and so forth. But the data import wizard is kind of a straightforward tool that you can use without having to download a program and do some just straight up imports into the system. Data loader is more powerful. It's a tool that you actually download to your desktop and then can run mass amounts of data at once. There's some controls. So it is a very powerful tool. But there are some limitations to both of these. And the reason why we just bring that up is that, both of these can still be tools that are leveraged in this entire process, but it's not going to necessarily do all the things that you need it to do. And that's why our tools kind of come in place to kind of fill in those gaps. So the first thing to talk about is, all fields are, so all map fields are updated regardless of existing data. So you can't say, don't update this based on this criteria using either one of these tools necessarily. There is limited duplicate matching for both of these out of the box tools. They don't offer any translations or transformations. So if you're taking a code and trying to transform that into a different value, you're not able to do that. There's limited query and reference ability. There's no native scheduling ability. You can do some scheduling with data loader, but it's not, I would say, the easiest thing to set up. And, data import wizard doesn't save mappings. Data loader does, using what's called a SEL file. But again, that mapping is going to be more like, one object at a time. So that's the other thing just to highlight here is that if you're using data loader and you're creating a bunch of records, you're just creating one record at a time, meaning you're just creating contact records only. You're not necessarily creating a contact and its related application and its related test scores all at once. And that's kind of why we have our tools in place to kind of assist in this process. So kind of looking at the next slide here, we have a tool that sits within Salesforce called Import Rx. So many of you may use this today. If you're a guest with us, you may have no idea what this is. But essentially what Import Rx allows us to do is we can take those native Salesforce import tools and import them into a holding table. And it's an object called a big table. And what that allows you to do is to really create different sources or different types of imports in this kind of holding table. When you do that initial upload into that big table, it's not creating, let's say, a contact record or an application record. It's just creating a holding table record. And that holding table record then can go through what's called Import Rx, which sits within Salesforce, and then create new objects, use transformations, such as reference transformations. You can schedule jobs, and you can have different mappings for different sources. So whether it's an ACT file or a Common App file or a SAT file, just as a few examples, each one of those can have its own quote unquote import Rx mapping and have their own scheduled jobs to run at certain times. The other thing that it allows you to do is at each field, you're able to make a decision whether or not it should overwrite the existing value. So if it's a phone number, for example, perhaps you would like that to update the existing value if they do not match. And so there's a lot of power to this tool. As we kind of go through some of the demos today, you'll be able to see how Import Rx can be leveraged. The other just quick note I want to make is that because Import Rx is, uses a big table object in Salesforce, a lot of the native tools within Salesforce that you can use on objects can be used on the big table. So for example, things like formula fields or flows or workflows to run updates on that big table when it gets imported initially are all additional tools that you can use as part of this import process.
All right.
Matt, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So talked a little bit about native import tools. Salesforce also has quite a bit of native integration functionality. And I think if we were going to talk about just Salesforce integrations, we could spend hours or maybe even days talking about ways to integrate with Salesforce. But in today's conversation around common data sets in higher education, kind of the things that make sense or might make sense to talk about would be Salesforce Connect, a way that with Salesforce you can actually connect to an external database. For a lot of our clients in the higher ed space, that this is an option, but maybe not the right fit for these types of scenarios. It is not going to be compatible with your formula fields or lookup filters or flow or your workflow rules or field history tracking, things that we know that you're going to want on your application object in the CRM. So that gets us into the Salesforce data APIs. And Salesforce offers a robust API options from REST, SOAP, streaming, and bulk. And if you don't know what those are or haven't been familiar with those, that's certainly okay. If you've ever used the data loader that Matt mentioned earlier, you are already leveraging some of those API options. So if you're going to use an API, you do need some type of tool or connector that's going to connect to Salesforce and your other data set. Now, when we think about these common data sets for higher ed, the complication becomes, or the challenge becomes, how do you take custom data from Common App or custom data from your nursing CAS or PT CAS or OT CAS application and map that into Salesforce into your custom Salesforce fields with a standard connector. So that can be one challenge. If you look to have a developer simply write and develop on these different APIs, then it's a question of how nimble is that connection. If you're doing this declaratively, as you make changes to your application in Common App year over year, or your nursing CAS from one cycle to the next, how easy is it to adjust those changes to Salesforce? And it's because of those questions and the challenges that we see clients sometimes face that we would like to talk about Integration Rx. So with Integration Rx, it is an Enrollment Rx service that's customized around each client's integration needs. So it's not a one-size-fits-all out-of-the-box solution, but we're really working with each client to understand the business process and how that data needs to live in all your various systems. We can cover comprehensive data, process, and presentation integration. So as you think about the student that's submitting their application maybe in OTCAS, that becomes a submitted application in Salesforce, and that is a submitted application in your student information system. So we offer bidirectional synchronization between Salesforce and your SIS. I mentioned in my introduction that I came from one of my schools that I came from was a Banner school, and we certainly have extensive experience working with Banner. We also have clients using Colleague and PeopleSoft and Genzabar. So if you're curious about how your SIS fits into Integration RX, reach out. Would be happy to talk to you about that. We are agnostic when it comes to your SIS or ERP. We can offer both real-time and batch integration, and it may be a different choice for each client. And what we're going to see today from our examples is that Integration Rx really gives us the power to automate data delivery, not just from the student information system, but also from all of these third-party data sets that we're going to be talking about. At each level, we have the ability to customize the data for our clients and customize those transformations that no two clients connecting to ACT are going to process that data the same way. And we know that no two clients, that even if they use the same student information system, values could be different, stored procedures could be different. So everything is customized around the client's business process and data model. For Integration Rx, we leverage enterprise-level iPaaS technology for our ETL tool. So what that means for our partners and clients is that we are using what Gartner considers an industry leader in the integration platform as a service space. So that when you're working with Integration Rx, you are not only contracting with us for the service that we're going to provide you, but also the technology that we're using so that you're not having to go out and buy any additional software licenses or tools for your integration needs. As we talk through today, these common higher education data sources, we're talking about really any third-party data set that you would want to bring into Salesforce. It could be data sets such as test scores from GMAT, SAT, GRE, TOEFL. It could be something from FrontRush. It could be a vendor that you're working with for your search. Or maybe it could be WebAdmit and various CAS applications, or even Common App and your Common App applications.
All right, so kind of talking now a little bit about some scenarios. So Matt just talked about the common application and some different kind of scenarios that we often see. So we're going to go through 4 scenarios kind of for the remainder of our time today. And so for the first scenario, Enrollment University is a member institution with a common application. The admissions operation team downloads the data files along with the application and transcript PDFs daily through the member center. The Associate Dean of Admissions Operation is concerned with the amount of time required to process the data and attach the PDFs in Salesforce. She wants to automate the import of the common app applications into Salesforce to track applications and statuses. How do you go about doing this with Enrollment Rx tools?
Yeah, that's a great question, and definitely a common scenario that we run into, and we have a couple prerequisites for that particular scenario. So if you are a current member of the Common App, you would also need to subscribe to the Common App's Scheduled Delivery Service, or SDS. This is the process via the Common App that will allow us to connect to their systems and retrieve that data for you. And you're also going to need Integration Rx to facilitate this particular scenario. So how this would work, once our student submits the application, it's the act of submitting that application that's going to trigger the SDS to deliver the data set and all of the accompanying documentation or transcripts, letters of reference, etc., to a FTP server. Integration Rx is going to pick up those files and insert the data into Import Rx into Bigtable as individual records. Import Rx will then go through and it's going to perform all of our matching using those robust duplicate rules to upsert all of our data into our admissions related objects. And after that import is complete, Integration Rx will then come behind and attach all of our document files to the correct records within Salesforce. So let's take a look and see how this might work. All right, sorry about that. Just got a message that we don't have sound. So we are going to try to reshare and get the sound included there for you. All right, so let's try that again. In our scenario, we want Integration Rx to automatically pick up files from the Common App and deliver those files to Import Rx. Specifically, we want the records to insert into Bigtable. Common App SDS files are typically available prior to 8 a.m. Eastern Time each day. So let's go to Bigtable and see what's already available. Here, we have Integration Rx has inserted a Common App record. So we can see the source is Common App. Our status is new, and it's for someone named Abigail applicant. Let's take a closer look at Abigail's Bigtable record. Because we're using Integration Rx, we're setting an import date of today's date, 4/21. We're also able to include the file name in Bigtable. So if you would ever need to go back to the original source, you could find that from your Common App Member Center. We're able to set lead source, which is not in the file, but we know it's a value that we're to create a new contact. We have the Common App ID, the applicant's name, biographical information, her contact information, phone number and email, address, citizenship, and the application information. And again, because we're using Integration Rx, we're able to set our status as submitted app while that record is inserting into Bigtable. Now, how does the Bigtable information go from Bigtable into Salesforce as a contact and application? For that, we're going to need to take a look at the mapping page. So here's the mapping page for the Common App. We have our contact is our first point of mapping, so we're mapping to the contact object. We have fields from the Bigtable on the left, mapping to fields in the contact on the right. We can see by the checkbox that this field will override any existing data on the contact, If the box was not checked, we would not override existing data. We also have a transformation on this particular term field where we're mapping term to initial term of interest. In this case, this is a reference transformation where we're using the value in the term field on Bigtable. We're looking up to the term object in Salesforce, finding a matching record with a term name that matches the value from term on Bigtable, and returning the record ID. Reference transformations are great anytime you have a lookup value or lookup field in Salesforce. So now let's see if we already have a contact for an application record in Salesforce for Abigail applicant. Here we have Abigail's existing information. It's an inquiry for fall 22. We don't know that much about her yet. We're missing some contact information. This information came from an RFI on our website, but she hasn't submitted the application yet. So let's import the Common App. Now, if we were going to import this on a daily basis, we would want this to run on a schedule, and we would set that schedule with the Schedule Import tab. So here, we're setting up a schedule. We're naming our schedule Common App. We've selected our Common App source, and we're going to run this daily with a start date, an end date, and a start time. I'm going to commit this schedule to Import Rx by clicking the Submit button. Now, I don't want to wait for this schedule to run, so I'm going to go to the Import Data tab and manually import Abigail's information. So on the Import Data tab, we can see all of our schedules, including our newest Common App schedule. And then we can see that we have 2 records ready for import. Common App, one from Common App, one from ACT. I'm going to click the checkbox, and I'm going to click the Import Data button. The green success box indicates our record imported successfully. So let's go back to our Bigtable record and take a look at Abigail applicant. So back on Bigtable, we can see that this record processed as a duplicate. It found the matching record and updated that particular record. This Bigtable record is also now connected to Abigail applicant. So we could go to Abigail's contact and see what's changed with her contact since the import. Now, with Abigail applicant's contact information, she now has a submitted application for fall 22, majoring in art and design, and we know she attended Boston Arts Academy. We've also included filled in some of the blanks, some of the information we didn't know about Abigail, such as her phone numbers. Now, hypothetically for today's scenario, let's say we were ready to review Abigail's record. So from her application, let's mark Abigail as ready for review. Integration and Import Rx work in conjunction with all other Enrollment Rx products, including Reader Rx. Here we have applications ready for review, including Abigail applicant. Let's review Abigail's application. Here we have all the information we would need to make a decision, including a transcript. The great thing about Integration Rx, as we insert records into Bigtable, process those records in Bigtable with Import Rx, we're then able to follow up and attach records from the Common App into our education history or all right, so we have been able to attach into our education history and various objects within Salesforce. We have been able to achieve that presentation display of moving those items from Common App on over into Salesforce so that for our review committee to review. Now, as we think about application records, in our scenario, yeah, sorry about that, few technical issues there. As we think about what we've gone through in that particular scenario, it was a process-driven automation. So it was the act of the applicant submitting their application within the Common App that triggers that integration start processing. In today's example, we were thinking about submitted applications, but it could be a similar case for if you're using prospect or suspect data from Common App as well. We're able to bring in both the data and the documents into Salesforce so that we're able to achieve that presentation of those Common App documents through Reader Rx for your review committee. With your applicants in Salesforce, you're then able to engage these applicants as you would an applicant who applied through your portal. So you're able to engage with them via email and social. You're able to bring them into your student portal so they can track their application status as any other applicant. And of course, we could also integrate this information into your student information system. And while today's example was really focused on the Common App, we can take the similar process and apply that to a centralized application or other third-party application as well.
Great, thanks, Matt. So let's talk about another kind of scenario here. So now that the Common Application is integrated into Salesforce, the Associate Dean wants to leverage the parent data included within the data file to create contacts and relationships within Salesforce to allow communications with parents. How can she accomplish this with Enrollment Rx?
Yeah, so another great question. How do we create multiple contacts from one row of data? And while not specified necessarily within our scenario, when we think about relationships, we're really thinking about working with a Salesforce org with EDA, or the Education Data Architecture, to where relationships are a junction object joining two different contacts. So let's take a look at this scenario. In this scenario, we want to create contact records for our parents from the Common App data set. If you're receiving applications from the Common App, you know that the parent and applicant data, all the fields are contained within one row in the data file. Let's take a look at Luke's big table record. I've already used Integration Rx to map my parent fields into Big Table. I've created a new section on the Big Table record called Family. I have the parent type, the parent first name, last name, and email address. You, of course, may have additional fields depending on what field and values you have selected for your Common App SDS template. Also, note that I've created a field called Create Parent Record. This is a checkbox that I'm marking as true using Integration Rx anytime a parent inserts, or anytime parent data inserts along with the applicant's data. Let's go ahead and process this particular applicant. I'm going to go to Import Data, and I'm going to check the box for Common App and click Import Data. So we see the import was a success, and when the page refreshes, we now have a parent record to import. Let's go back to Big Table and look at this parent record. So here's our parent record. The source is parent, the status is new, contact is blank because the import hasn't processed yet, but the applicant is Luke Skywalker, and we know that the relationship is that Luke is the son of our Big Table record, Anakin Skywalker, and we have Anakin's email address. So now let's import Anakin's record. I'm going to check the box for parent. I'm going to click Import. The import was a success. Now when we look, we have two records on the big table, one for Luke, one for Anakin. We'll take a look at Anakin's, and now Anakin has a contact. And we can click into Anakin's contact record. We can see here that record type is set to parent. We see that we have a relationship, and that Anakin Skywalker has a relationship to Luke Skywalker. And it tells us in the explanation that Luke Skywalker is Anakin Skywalker's son. So that all looks great. How do we do this? Well, it really all comes from the mapping page in Import Rx. From our parent mapping, we have our parent fields mapped to the contact, including our record type, but we're also mapping a relationship record. We're mapping type and applicant. So that when we are importing the records, we import the applicant first. The successful process of the applicant's record creates the parent's new big table record, and then we can subsequently import the parent record into Salesforce, creating those relationships. So we're leveraging Integration Rx, Import Rx, and some flow to create relationship records in Salesforce for our applicant and our parent. All right, so again, today's scenario, we're really talking about the Common App, but this could certainly, again, be applied to any number of applications where you're receiving parent or guardian or guidance counselor type information along with the student's record or your applicant's record. So we are using Integration Rx to insert that parent data into the applicant's big table record. And if there were multiple parents in the file, we would just want to map multiple parents on into big table. When we're thinking about EDA and the relationship records require two contacts. This is why we want to process the applicant's big table record first. The act of processing that applicant's big table record then creates big table records for the parents, and we're able to map into those relationships. A really important thing to consider when working with either parent or guidance counselor information is your record types. When I'm creating records on big table, I like to use record types on big table just to make the data easier to read, but there's really no impact there for the business process. When we think about the contact, then there's certainly some business process implications for record type. You wouldn't want a record type on your contact for your applicant assigned to the parent. You wouldn't want those particular individuals getting the same types of recruitment messaging. So you want to make sure and target the correct messaging based off the correct record type. But once those parents are in your Salesforce org as contacts, think of all the different ways that you can then engage with those particular parents. If you're using Form Builder Rx to create a parent portal, those parent records can flow naturally into that portal, and your parents can engage with the process. You can communicate with parents about important dates for your events that you may be hosting through Events Rx. And of course, as your applicants then matriculate and become students, you can be communicating with parents about family weekend, homecoming, and eventually graduation. Parents may even be a great population where development may want to reach out for additional giving opportunities for parents. So there's several ways you can engage with your applicants' parents throughout the student life cycle.
Great, thanks, Matt. So let's talk about the next scenario for alumni and development. So your institution's Office of Alumni and Development partnered with a virtual tour platform to offer alumni and donors a view of the new engineering building and classroom space. Tour participants register and complete a short form prior to their 360-degree experience. The tour vendor provides API access to the data from registration form and other meaningful metrics. the alumni tour coordinator wants to add each visitor to a Salesforce campaign. How could integration and Import Rx work together to achieve this goal?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Another great scenario, and kind of the prerequisites to move forward with this scenario is we're going to need the API credentials for that particular vendor. So that may be something along the lines of username, password, API key, organization ID, but we'll work with you to figure out what exactly is needed based off of the API documentation, and we'll help figure that out and kind of guide you when you're asking for those credentials from the vendor. And you're going to need Integration Rx. So the way this process would work, Integration Rx would connect to that API securely, retrieve our data, and insert the data into Bigtable, creating a unique Bigtable record for each alumni tour participant. Along with our tour participant data, Integration Rx is also going to set up our campaign name, lead source, and other fields that we know we're going to need during the import process. So when we're thinking about importing that data or inserting that data into Bigtable, it doesn't necessarily have to exist already in our data set for Integration Rx to create that if we know it's part of that particular business process. Then we're using Import Rx to follow up, take all of those Bigtable records and import those records into Salesforce and add those records into our campaign. So let's take a look and see how this might work. In this scenario, the alumni office wants Integration Rx to connect to the virtual tour API and retrieve the virtual tour attendee data. Integration Rx inserts a new Bigtable record for each attendee. In addition to the attendee's name, biographical information, and email address, Integration Rx also inserts a campaign name and campaign status, even though these data points were not in the original data set. Now, let's go to the mapping page and create a new data source and mapping for our alumni. I could create a brand new mapping, but instead, I'm going to start with our parent mapping that we used in our earlier example. I'm going to click the clone button. I'm going to name our new data source alumni, an exact match to the source field on Bigtable. I'm going to click the clone button. Now that our new data source is successfully created, I can go ahead and remove the relationship object, as that was not a requirement in this scenario. Instead, I'm going to add in campaign member. With campaign member, campaign ID is a required field. However, at this time, I don't know the campaign ID, but I do know the campaign name. So I'm going to add campaign name from Bigtable, and I'm going to save my mapping. With the mapping saved, I can now add in a transformation. I'm going to use a reference transformation. In this case, I'm going to look up to the campaign object. I'm going to find the campaign name that matches the name in the campaign field on Bigtable, and I want to return the campaign ID. I'm going to click Submit. In addition to the campaign name, I also want to import the campaign status and map the status field, or map to the status field on campaign member. I can now update my mapping. With the mapping created, let's go to the Import Data tab and import our new alumni record. I'm going to check the box next to alumni, and I'm going to click Import Data. All of our records successfully imported. So let's go back to Bigtable and take a look at our record. On Bigtable, I can see that our record processed as a duplicate. Import Rx found an existing contact and matched that contact. So let's take a look at our contacts record. On the contact page, we can see that this is an alumni record type. We have our name and email address. And in our campaign history, we now have our campaign. We can see that we have the campaign name and status. So we have completed the requirement to import our contacts and add the contact to an existing campaign. In this scenario, so as we think through this particular scenario, we're able to now track our ROI within Salesforce. You can report on your campaign attendance through Salesforce dashboards. And of course, you're also able then to follow up with your alumni tour participants for other opportunities to engage with campus, or maybe even other possible giving opportunities through development later on down the road.
Great. Thanks, Matt. So in scenario 4, we're going to talk about beyond test scores, integrating for learner success. So the director of student services realizes that the ACT file contains student profile data that could help place and serve new students during the onboarding process. She wants her student success coaches and academic advisors to be able to access this information in Salesforce. How can this additional information be added to an existing ACT import?
All right, so we're working with an existing ACT integration and imports. We've already established the API connection to Encora and the ACT data. One of the prerequisites would be some familiarity with this particular student profile data and how you want to use that data to enhance that student coaching or academic advising process. So included within that data set, your potential applicant is going to answer questions that related to, will they need assistance with educational plans once they get to college? They may be raising their hand to tell you that they're going to need assistance with writing, study skills, or maybe even math. You might be interested in some of the interests from the student profile as well. Something like, the student wants to participate in ROTC, or maybe how many hours per week that student will plan to study. So as you think about these different data points that you would have access to from the data set, how would you incorporate these into your student success planning? Would you add new checklist items for your applicant during orientation? Would you promote your ROTC program through your student portal? So all of those types of questions come into play. Let's see how we can import some of this data. In this scenario, we are already using Integration Rx to download ACT information and insert test score data into Bigtable. We want to expand upon that existing insert and ACT import. On the Bigtable record, we already have our information for our ACT test taker, Claire. We have our basic information as well as our test scores. And using Integration Rx, I was able to load some of her student profile data. Claire's going to need help with education plans when she gets to college. She's also indicated that she'll need help with study skills and with math. In this example, I want to create a case anytime that an applicant has given this information to us. So in addition to the student profile, I'm also using Integration Rx to set up my case data on Bigtable. So I have a subject, help with ed plans, study skills, math. A case status of on hold. We will wait to act upon this data until Claire matriculates into Enrollment University. We have a type of academic support and a case origin of ACT. Now that we have all of our data that we need on the Bigtable, we need to expand our existing mapping. So let's go to the mapping page. On the mapping page, we're on the ACT source. We already have our contact, an application, and test scores. So we want to add our case object to our existing mapping. I'm going to select case from the related records and click add object. I now have a case attached to my existing contact. So I can start selecting my big table fields, such as subject. And I'm going to map subject to the subject field on the case. Next, I will select my case origin, and I will map case origin to case origin on the case object. I'm going to select case status, and I will map case status to the status field on case. Finally, I'm going to select type, and I will map type to case type on the case object. I now have all 4 fields I need for my case, and now it's time to go ahead and add in the additional fields from the student profile. So I can add in help with education plans, help with writing, help with reading, help with study skills, and help with math. I now have all 4 of my student profile fields mapped to my case object. I want to save my work. Now, let's import the data for Claire and take a look at her case record. I'm going to go to Import Data. I'm going to select my ACT record and click the Import button. My import was a success. There are no new records to process at this time. I'm going to go back to my big table record. Now, let's refresh Claire's record. We can see that we've created a contact for Claire Standish, and let's go look at Claire. So we've created her contact, and here is our new case. The type is academic support, the status is on hold, case origin is ACT, and the subject is help with ed plans, study skills, math. When we open Claire's case, we can see that we have the student profile information on the case record ready for her academic coach or academic advisor to assist Claire with her planning, study skills, and math work in college. We've completed all the requirements in this scenario. All right, so with this type of scenario, as you're bringing in large volume of information, possibly from a test score, you definitely want to think about the storage of that data, where it's going to go, where it's going to live, and how long you would retain data for test takers that don't matriculate into your university. How will you use that data? What role will it play in your student success plans, in your coaching and advising sessions? Thinking about how would you engage your new incoming students during onboarding and coaching? Maybe like we talked about earlier, there would be an extra item to complete in their applicant portal for onboarding. And with these type of new metric or new data points coming in, are there success metrics that you could then look at for this type of data? Whether it's the number of coaching sessions, first semester GPA, persistence from fall to spring, or possibly even retention. Are there ways that we can take existing data and help improve that student process? I think as we think about these types of key takeaways, they apply to a lot of the different items that we've discussed today. So with higher ed, at Enrollment Rx, we often talk about the RAD solutions as related to recruitment, admissions, and decisions. And we know that integration and import play a key role for those functions. But as we've seen today, integration and import can also benefit alumni, development, and even student success. And we didn't talk about front rush in an example today, but that would be a great way for athletics and admissions to both benefit from that type of integration and import. With your existing integration and imports that you have going today, is there additional data that you could be leveraging? Could you be creating those additional contact records for parents, for guidance counselors, maybe employers, or can you leverage additional data from your students? Then as we think about integrating for success, success can look like different things for different users and even at different levels. Maybe for the business unit, it is success in your ability to get more work completed at a little bit faster pace, right? So you have more productivity. If you're thinking about a user who would be engaged with this type of work today, if they are spending 30 minutes a day downloading files and importing files into your system, that's 2.5 hours a week. Over a 52-week year, that's 130 hours. So you have 3 weeks of one person's time dedicated to moving files. What could that person be doing for the office? How could their productivity go up with automated integration and automated imports? For the university perspective, thinking about how you can engage parents earlier, how can you engage alumni for other development campaigns, and how can you make sure that you're using the best data to keep your learners engaged and achieving their success outcomes. And of course, for the learner, we're thinking about the applicant who has better access to their application status through their portal. We're thinking about the applicant who receives more timely and appropriate coaching and advising information because we have those types of data points. And when we think about why Enrollment Rx, we think about the combination that we can bring both integration and imports together. So with Integration Rx, it's the ability to securely connect to those third-party applications and data sources, bring all of that information into Bigtable, customized to your needs and mappings and transformations. It's the ability of Import Rx to go through and have those robust duplicate matching rules that will then match to existing contacts and applications. And we can follow up with Integration Rx, adding documents and integrating all of this into your student information system so that you have that 360-degree view of your applicants and your students. And with that, I will hand it back over to Matt.
Yeah, sounds great, Matt. So now kind of leads us to our Q&A kind of portion of today. So I think Mary asked a really good question. So she said, if we set up Import Rx to create campaign member records based on the campaign name matching, what happens if the campaign name doesn't match exactly? So you were showing that reference transformation earlier. So let's say that that name didn't match. Will there be an error letting us know to check for a typo, or will the campaign member record just not get created? So I don't know, Matt, I can speak to that as well, but maybe if you have any thoughts on that. So basically maybe talk through error handling with Import Rx.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that scenario can happen with campaigns, may also happen with education institutions or sometimes program names. What happens if the data coming in isn't an exact match? And in that case, Import Rx would provide an error, and it would tell you at what field level that error is occurring, so that you would know that it's the campaign name where that issue's happening. And at that point, it's going to be up to the person running your imports that as that error message gets kicked out, to either do they need to make some adjustments to the record that came in from or came into Import Rx, or do they need to go out and create that campaign or maybe adjust a typo in that campaign? But certainly messaging around those types of reference errors.
Sounds great. And for the participants, if you have any Q&A additional questions, feel free to type them into the box. Another question that I sometimes get, Matt, is how many are you able to control the batch size when it comes to Import Rx or some of these other import tools? So how many records essentially get processed at once?
Yeah, another great question. So we do have some batch size control as we set up the schedule for those records. It's not something we specifically called out today, but there is batch size control to where you want to think about not necessarily the number of records, but the number of objects and fields that you're mapping to, and how how essentially, how deep into the hierarchy are you going, whether it's contacts, applications, education history, so that, as you have more complex mappings, you can lower the batch size to reduce the any type of error that you would be having. And then we can also handle some of that with how you schedule your import. So if you have questions about scheduling, if you're running into scheduling issues, we'd certainly would be happy to talk to you about that as well.
Yeah, another thing I would just add to that is just keep in mind when you're creating records, right, or updating records in Salesforce. So if you're doing a large like import, for example, just kind of be cognizant of what other things that might trigger, right? So if you have a lot of flows or process builders in the background that are firing when that's happening and you're trying to do, a bunch of records at once, sometimes that can lead to some issues. So those are all things that I would say that you want to take into the evaluation process with any integration or import tool.
Yeah, and I think, Matt, the thing I would add there, thinking about your comment, is that what's great about Import Rx is that not only do you have those other automation pieces happening, but you're thinking about what is your user's experience from Salesforce during their workday. And with Import Rx, we can schedule around the workday. So maybe you're using time after business hours or before business hours for some of those larger imports. That way you're not impacting any type of system performance. And it's really one of the nice ways we can sync integration with imports and have those schedules together, so that hopefully by the time your users log in, that data is there and ready for them, and you're not waiting on those imports.
Yeah, and another question that sometimes comes up, and I know that you mentioned this in like the campaign example that you gave, is around duplicate matching per object. So in Import Rx, for example, I know you can set up duplicate matching on like the contact object, but can you do it on related objects as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So with Import Rx, you want to start with your contact, of course, first, but with something like the application, you could match on an application record that is at a certain status or for a certain term or certain program, and it's going to find the applications that match for that particular applicant, right? So it's already taken the contact into consideration. The same would apply to if you're using an education history, you might be matching off of the SEEB code that is associated with it, with an education history's account record. If we were going to add duplicate matching for a campaign, we could, of course, then use that same campaign name for duplicate matching as well. So if we know who we invited from to participate in our tour, that they were already in the campaign as a participant, we can match on campaign name, then to later mark them as attended.
Great. And there's another setting, Matt, that sometimes gets asked about. It's called automatically update duplicates at a data source level. I think we saw it briefly in one of the demos today. I can speak to that as well, but do you have any like insights as to the difference if that box is checked or not checked?
To me, checking that box is a decision that you want to think about prior to setting up your duplicate rules. And every client's a little different. And it will depend upon your data source and how robust your data source might be. That with the box check, the automatically update on duplicates, if Import Rx finds an existing contact for that particular record that's bringing in from Bigtable, with the box checked, it'll go ahead and update that contact. Maybe also updating then the application or inserting a new application. So you don't have to, do any additional monitoring or review unless there was an error like we discussed here a moment earlier. So if you don't check the box, in that case, as that import runs, if it's say it's running on a schedule and Import Rx finds an existing record that is a potential duplicate, it will not process that record. Instead, it will change the value to new duplicate so that a user can then go back and individually or manually process those records. And as you manually process records from the import data tab, it'll present, our Import Rx will present the big table record along with the fields from the contact. So you can make the decision, you have a set of human eyes on the record to make the decision, is this truly a match? And I would say the reason to think about that in setting up your duplicate rules is the goal to have a set of rules that will be very precise to target in on that exact match, or is the goal to bring about, find a set of records where any one of those potential records could be a match? So it may be a little bit different strategy in setting up those duplicate rules on whether or not you want to check that box. Just from personal experience, I like to be able to have those robust rules, check the box, and I'll let Import Rx do the work.
Yeah, I would definitely say best practice is to check that box once you're confident in your duplicate rules in Import Rx. I would also just say, though, if you're setting up a net new source and kind of getting your feet wet with real live data in that automatic checkbox of update duplicates, it might be something where you keep that checkbox off for the first one or two imports as you kind of vet it out and just make sure it's working as expected. But that is a setting that sometimes we get asked about related to that. Great. Thanks, Matt. And then the last thing I just want to mention, it's not really a question as much as a new feature. So we enhance Import Rx just like any of our products. And one of the enhancements we had recently was the ability to leverage standard Salesforce duplicate rules. So if you have standard Salesforce duplicate rules you would like to use instead of Import Rx duplicate rules, that was a request actually from one of our clients, that ability does exist as well. So just something that to make you aware of. So with that, as we kind of go from Q&A, we just have a few, one or two last slides here that we can just kind of chat through. So Matt, if you want to go to the next slide. So we have our next industry expert series with Paul Chacon on data governance in Salesforce. So this is a really, I think, important topic and, I think more Salesforce centric, but especially for higher education institutions. How can you ensure you have the right data protection as well as the right management of your data in Salesforce? Paul is a very, very knowledgeable person on our team, and that'll be a great session upcoming. And then also, as we talk about the Enrollment Rx solution, go ahead. We have for our clients, the RAD Navigator, which again has video libraries, user manuals, product release, FAQs. And so any kind of product announcements we have as well, things like this webinar and all our previous ones will all be in that centralized spot. So we definitely recommend you check that out. And then Matt, if you want to go to the next one, if we have any guests with us, again, Enrollment Rx sits on Salesforce natively. And so we have out-of-the-box solutions for a variety of things, which include Integration Rx that Matt talked about today and Import Rx. And if you want to go to the next slide, it's kind of sets on the foundation. So all of our products sit natively on Salesforce and are used that way. You saw some things in our demos today, like Sales and Service Cloud, and we can interact with all those. And feel free, if you're not a current client, to reach out to us with any questions related to that. And before we jump off, let's see, we have just a few more minutes here. So Mike did pop in a question here at the end before we jump off here, Matt. So how do you handle contact record types for parents who are alumni? Was his question. I don't know if that's something you want to address right now, or we can maybe follow up with Mike after the session today.
Certainly happy to follow up afterwards. I think it's going to be a question of some business process and how you want to handle that particular use case. Certainly would not want to overwrite the alumni record type there. So thinking about how else can you work with that particular use case and just kind of thinking through that. And but yeah, certainly happy to follow up with Mike.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Matt. And thank you, everyone, for attending the session today. It will be recorded and posted on the Rad Navigator. For anybody who missed it, or if you want to review any of the material, feel free to reach out. And there will be a little survey that pops up at the end. Any feedback you could provide would be appreciated. And with that, we'll give you some time back in the rest of your day and hope you have a great afternoon.